Okay. So as I mentioned today, we're going to be talking about the Asteraceae family. And this is just a really a gigantic family. I think it's pretty much only second to the orchid family when it comes to flowering plants. And so, this is just kind of a general guide, but they estimate there's over 1,600 genera and over 23,000 species. I think that's even larger depending on what resource you use. There could be even upwards of over 30,000 species of plants in this family. So it is a very big family. When it comes to distribution and types of plants, these are scattered worldwide. So you're seeing these on almost every continent, and primarily, they're going to be in the forms of herbs, shrubs, or trees. A lot of the ones we're talking about today and the ones that we see that are native to North America are, of course, in the form of herbaceous plants. Now, when it comes to characteristics of this family, uh, primarily what they have in common is the flowering structure, and we're going to get into that in the next slide. Their leaves, however, generally are going to be more of a simple leaf. There are a few that have a compound leaf structure, but that's kind of less, not as common. And then there's different leaf arrangements. And so what I mean by leaf arrangements, anything from opposite, alternate, or world leaf arrangements. So that can vary a bit. Um, the fruits that are produced after it flowers are generally in a keen fruit. They're generally very dry. Seed heads makes it much easier for collection, if you will, especially if you're trying to preserve seeds for the next year. So we'll talk about that with a couple of these plants today. Again, I'm kind of skipping over the flowering structure because I'll bring that up in this next slide. But a lot of this family, especially when we think of these plants, we think of our aesthetic ornamentals that we use in our gardening beds that really create really nice flowers, even cut flowers, things of that nature. Again, it's more to promote the beauty of the plant. What we're going to talk about today is how much so many members of these families are really important to our pollinator species, whether they're serving as a nectar source or they're also providing the larval food source of a moth or butterfly caterpillar. But even going beyond the ornamental aspect, this family is important when it comes to food production. And so, actually, we do have a lot of members of this family, not just sunflowers, which we'll talk about, of course, with sunflower seeds, sunflower oil. But if you think about it, a lot of our kind of like leafy vegetables, things like lettuce, actually belong to this family. We just may not think of it from that perspective, just because, of course, we're not growing lettuce for the flowers, right? We're growing it for the leaves, and we don't want it to set flower, of course. Um, but yeah, so lettuce and then things like artichokes also belong to this family. So it's a very diverse plant family. So let me get back to the flowering structure. So with members of this family, most of them have what's called a composite flowering head. And what that means is typically it's broken up into two different flowers, or we call them florets, where we have the ray florets, which in our eyes almost look like the petals of a flower, right? But actually, what we think of as each individual petal, it's actually not a petal, it's its own flower. So that's kind of a unique aspect to this. And so whenever we're looking at, say, this picture of a sunflower, you have all these different ray florets, and each one is its own unique flower. And so you can have hundreds and hundreds of ray florets that belong on one flower head. And the same goes for what we call disc florets. So this is typically the center part of the flowering structure. A lot of times we call these the domes, especially with our echinaceas and our rudbeckias. And with each little disc floret, you have all these hundreds and hundreds of tiny, tiny little flowers. So, and you can kind of visualize that a little bit better on a sunflower. So whenever you think of that center part and how many seeds after the bloom is done are on that head, it's pretty substantial. So, it's funny because when we're looking at this picture of this sunflower, we think, oh, that's just one flower. But in reality, you've got two different types of flowers, the rays and the discs, and then you've got just honestly hundreds of both of them. And so it's pretty unique in that aspect. And so what we find with this family is you're going to have plants that produce these ray and disc florets, or sometimes they may just produce all ray florets and be very limited in their discs. So we'll just kind of go into each individual species of plant here. But that's just kind of the common characteristic with these plants is the flowering head. And when we think about botany in general, especially prior to DNA analysis, a lot of times plants were grouped into their families based on their flowering structure. So that's what we go off of primarily, especially when it comes to classifying plants. Okay. So it is really hard to talk about this is such a diverse plant family, and there's so many different plants. And so it's really hard to nail down just 10 plants that I can talk about within this hour. So I apologize if maybe there is a plant you wanted me to mention that's not on here, because the struggle is real because there are so many wonderful plants in this family. So, of course, I'm going to have to talk about this is known as the daisy and aster family. So I feel like I have to talk about at least one type of aster. And so, I may have been a little biased with picking this aster. I picked one of my favorites, and that is the New England aster. And so the New England aster is native here to Kentucky. It's primarily native east of the Mississippi, so found along the eastern United States. This is one of our taller, more upright asters. They can get quite tall, up to 6 feet tall, actually. And if I were giving this as a gardening class, I would tell you that you might want to consider, trimming it halfway through the growing season just to prevent it from flopping over or flowering too early. Um, but with most asters, a lot of these are going to be your late summer, early fall bloomers. We do have some kind of woodland aster species that do tend to bloom in the spring, but in particular, this aster is going to be kind of going into our later summer months into the fall. Now, characteristics with this plant, you'll kind of notice with a lot of these species we talk about, a lot of them have very rough, hairy leaves and stems. And so they may not be quite fun to the touch. But one thing that is a benefit of having kind of this rough foliage is generally it is more deer resistant. I say that, I mean, deer will still browse on it, but generally deer are not fond of this rougher foliage. They tend to like more tender growth. And so kind of what you'll notice with a lot of these plants is they are what we would kind of consider more deer resistant. Again, deer could still browse on them and eat them, but just maybe not as much as other plants. Now, with the New England aster, so this does produce both your ray and disc florets. So usually these arrays are this pinky purple color with a center yellow disc. Now, I will say in other aster species, Sometimes those yellow discs may actually change and transition to more of a reddish color depending on the species too. Now, with these, as I had mentioned, these produce this kind of akene fruit, and so it produces this dry seed that easily can spread in the fall, or you can collect seeds. A lot of times these seeds are well beloved by our songbird species and even some of our small mammals. And so something that I'll mention, especially with other plants that we talk about today, is you want to leave those seed heads up into the fall and winter months just because it provides a really great food source for our wildlife. It's very important for that. So, especially when we think about garden cleanup in the fall, I would honestly encourage you all to leave these up to allow the wildlife to feed on them. Some other things of note with asters, of course, this is a great pollinator plant. This is what we consider a great late nectar food source. And actually, when we think of what we call keystone plant species, asters and goldenrod, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, are really key plant species for our insect populations. And so not only are bees and butterflies going to be attracted to the nectar, but it is also a larval food source for certain butterfly species, such as the pearl crescent caterpillar. And then it also helps support specialized bee populations. And so when we talk about specialized bees, these are bees that are honestly specialized to certain plant species or plant families, and so there is a type of aster bee that you know, really needs to have aster species in order to survive. So, just kind of an example there about the importance of being able to keep these in our local ecosystems as well as planting them for these insects. Some other things to note, asters do make great cut flowers if you wanted to have some in a fall flowering arrangement. Uh, when growing them, they're pretty hardy plants, but they can be susceptible to things like powdery mildew or worse, disease known as aster wilt. And one thing I should have mentioned, like when I started this slide, so asters used to be in the genus Aster, which makes a lot of sense, but they have since been reclassified, most of them into the Symphyotrichum. So a lot of our native asters have been reclassified into Symphyotrichum. But if you have old field guides, you may see them still listed, of course, in the aster genus. So not to confuse you, but there has been reclassification there. All right. I had to bring in some kind of daisy, and I didn't want to do like, say, a Shasta daisy or anything like that. So I figured let's bring in the good old-fashioned English daisy. So Bellis perennis, and Bellis, of course, meaning beautiful in Latin. So these are not native. They are not native to North America. In fact, they could actually potentially be what we consider invasive in North America in parts of it. They have kind of escaped the ornamental status and have become kind of weedy in certain areas of the US. But these are native to Europe and Africa and Asia. Now, there's a few different types of the English daisy. This has been generally cultivated. The traditional English daisy is kind of what you think of as a normal daisy. It has kind of those white ray florets and then those yellow center discs. But we do have some cultivars that are much brighter and more colorful that are out there. And oftentimes with those cultivated ones, we here, especially in Kentucky, kind of treat it as an annual, where we're growing them because they look pretty during the summer months, but then they're not going to survive the frost. A lot of times we can easily get these as seed packets too at our local garden centers and big box stores. Now, in general, with when it comes to English daisies, they're a very low growing daisy, and that's why sometimes they can be easily dispersed and just become a weed in our different lawns and fields. They have kind of more of this rosette leaf, and if you look at the leaves closely, a lot of times they can be lobed, but also kind of create this little spoon shape to them. Now, with these daisies, they some of the cultivars, I'll say this, some of the cultivars are a little bit more heat tolerant than the original English daisy. But generally they start to decline as we get into really hot summer heat, which can definitely be a problem here in Kentucky. Now, where these also can become more invasive is they like heavy fertility. And so if you have been, say, heavily fertilizing a lawn, like you're doing like a fertilizer regimen on them, or maybe near your garden, like if you have heavily fertilized a vegetable garden, sometimes that's where we come across problems with this daisy is it likes that high fertility, and so it's going to spread easier in that type of environment. But again, generally, it's not usually as much of an issue for us. Generally, we're just here in Kentucky, we're growing them for ornamental purposes, and treat them as an annual. All right, chamomile. So I actually have two different chamomiles that I'm going to talk about. There's the Roman chamomile, and then there's our German chamomile. And so, not to try to confuse you all, but there are two different types. And if anyone's an avid tea drinker, I'm definitely an avid tea drinker. I love drinking tea. I just figured this would be a good time to talk about chamomile. So, Roman chamomile is the less common. Okay. This is not the chamomile that you are typically going to see when you are purchasing tea packets. Okay. Usually that's going to be the German chamomile, and we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. Okay. But Roman chamomile has been used in certain teas. However, it's very limited. Um, it does have medicinal purposes and has been used really over the scale of hundreds to thousands of years for treating different ailments. But what you have to watch with this Roman chamomile is you don't want to drink large quantities of it, just because it could um, cause issues such as long-term issues such as like vomiting, diarrhea, things like that. So this is not something that you just drink excessive amounts of. Now, again, I'm not a doctor, so I'm not trying to give you medical advice, but this is again a less commonly used chamomile. So, but people may drink it to try to get some benefit, some medicinal benefit. Um, this is a very fragrant chamomile compared to the other one, where both the flowers and the foliage are aromatic, especially whenever you crush the foliage. Um, and the flowers themselves kind of have this very light kind of herbal aroma to it. This is a very low growing, but also spreading plant as well. And so, I want to mention this because, I mean, again, it's less common. You're not going to see this as much on the market. And if you're growing chamomile, more than likely it's going to be the German chamomile. But I just want to tell you that there is a difference between the two. And I hate to say that this one's kind of more toxic because it can be used for certain purposes, but you do have to watch that. And especially if you are pregnant, you're expecting a baby, it's not recommended to consume Roman chamomile. Um, so just keep that in mind. Now, of course, you could in theory, you could grow this more strictly just because you like the flower and you want to attract bees and pollinators. So, like other members of this family, it is good for those purposes. It is a good pollinator magnet. So I'm going to switch gears. I'm just kind of going more in alphabetical order, but I'll again focus on that more on that German chamomile here in a bit. But let's talk about chrysanthemums because this is a very big plant genus and a very popular ornamental. So chrysanthemum originates from Asia and Europe, and we have many, many different chrysanthemum species. A lot of times we kind of think of them as our ordinary garden mums, but then we get some more unique species out there, like the Chinese chrysanthemum that has very interesting flowers. So when we think of the word chrysanthemum, it's derived from the Greek for gold flower. So we kind of think of the traditional yellow chrysanthemum, but of course there are many different color varieties that you can get with the exception of blue. Probably you can't really get a blue chrysanthemum, but you can get every other color of the rainbow pretty much. So when we're growing these chrysanthemums, so uh, depending on the type that you have, when we think of our standard garden mum, these are considered a perennial, and they're also what we considered a short day plant where it's going to start setting flower buds and starting to flower later in the season as our day lengths start to shorten, hence why it's called a short day plant. Um, but when we are buying these, a lot of times we almost treat them as an annual, like we're treating them as a decoration, and then we dispose of them at the end of the season. Um, Ideally, I can do a whole talk on mums, but ideally, whenever you're growing this, it would be best if you could find one somehow in the spring, plant it, and let it set root throughout the whole growing season, and then mulch it really well, and then it would come back for you the year after. Um, Ideally, you need to get it the earlier the better you can get a mum if you want to try to keep it as a perennial to try to keep it to come back year after year. Otherwise, if you just have it in a container and then you plant it really late in the fall, a lot of times it's probably not established enough that it's going to come back for you the next year. So you just kind of again treat it as an annual. So those are just things to kind of keep in mind with chrysanthemums. It is possible to keep them as a perennial, but a lot of times you need to um, plant them early enough in the season for their roots to establish, mulch them good for them to survive the winter. Now, when some other things with chrysanthemums, of course, they make a really good bedding plant. A lot of times, some of our other varieties we use as cut flowers. Most chrysanthemums have kind of these low to deeply serrated leaves. A lot of times when we cut those leaves, they do have an aroma to them. And I'll say this, what's interesting with chrysanthemums is they are recognized. We do have a National Chrysanthemum Society where there are shows, nationwide, and they do judging on different types of chrysanthemums. Right now, they recognize about 13 different bloom classes. So it's a very diverse, and those classes are based on the flowering structure and the shape of the petal. So anything from pompons to single to spire to quill to reflex, anemone, chrysanthemums, just whole broad area. So a lot of people are growing them for those aesthetic values. Now, people may grow chrysanthemums for other reasons too. So chrysanthemums are certain species have been used to make certain tea drinks before, especially a lot of the more yellow or white chrysanthemums to make chrysanthemum tea. But then also kind of more commonly, especially in the agriculture industry, there is a insecticide called pyrethrum, and pyrethrum is actually extracted from a certain species of chrysanthemum, and that helps with insect control. So that's actually a naturally occurring insecticide that's derived from this plant too. So if you see pyrethrum on a label, then part of that active ingredient is derived from this species. So very neat to think about that. Still, I'll say I'll go back to chrysanthemum real quick, but still, even though it's a naturally occurring insecticide, pyrethrum, it is still very potent. So just keep that in mind. All right, let's switch gears and let's talk about one that all of you probably are familiar with, but I feel like I need to talk about this because we're talking about the aster family, and that is Echinacea purpurea, or our purple coneflower. So this is Greek for spiny one because it produces these disc cones that are very spiny and almost hedgehog-like to the touch. And this is one of our native species here in Kentucky, found again primarily east of the Mississippi River. There are several different species of echinacea that are found throughout the U.S., but probably the poster child, if you will, is Echinacea purpurea. And so these have very coarse, rough leaves, just like we had mentioned, again, semi-deer resistant, if you will. And they produce pretty tall flowering stalks of those pinkish purple ray florets with those brown disc domes. And of course, with this plant, the reason why most of us are growing this and we have it kind of as a staple, especially for our meadow and prairie gardens, is because not only is it long lasting with the bloom, it'll bloom pretty much all summer into the fall for you. But it is a great nectar source for our butterflies and bees, especially loved by bees. Bees tend to really gravitate towards our daisy type flowers more so than others. Now, this is also beneficial for some of our caterpillar species. So if you kind of see from the pictures at the top, um, it is the it supports the silvery checker spot butterfly and the wavy lined emerald moth. So you'll kind of see actually when we talk about other species, a lot of our Asteraceae family supports these two species of lepidopterans. So very, very important in that regard. It's adored absolutely by songbirds, especially goldfinches. So every year you'll probably see goldfinches just kind of flock to your echinaceas. The plants, what I would recommend when it comes to these plants is leaving them up again during the fall and winter months. Leave those seed heads up to be enjoyed by our wildlife. Okay, so don't cut them down too early in the fall. Leave them up through the winter, and then as we get into the early springtime, right before things are starting to grow, then you can cut it down. But yeah, leave all that up for the birds. And honestly, what I like too, especially about purple coneflowers, is I think they provide a little bit more of winter interest, because if we do get some snow, then you get the snow that kind of sticks on those little domes, and it just kind of creates these cute little winter interest pieces in your garden. So I like it for that. Now, some other things, these have been used traditionally for medicine. Specifically, the roots have been used to treat a wide variety of ailments, especially with digestive issues. You may even see things like herbal supplements on the market that are for echinacea. And then previously, these have been fed to feed sick livestock like your cows and your horses, especially if they have upset stomachs. So just a little bit more interesting to note about it other than just ornamental purposes. So that's Echinacea purpurea, which again, when I think of this family, it's almost the poster child of the Asteraceae family. Something else that also is a good model for this family is Helianthus. And so this is our genus of sunflowers. So we do have plenty of sunflowers that are native to the US. Um, the one that we often grow, the Helianthus annuus, which is our annual sunflower that originates more from the Western United States. So it's not native here originally, although we do have some native perennial species of Helianthus that are found here. But regardless of what Helianthus you're growing, you can get a lot of benefits of this plant. So I'm just kind of specifically talking about the annual right now, just because that's what we commonly see and grow. But a lot of times when we plant this, we start this directly from seed and we plant these along our vegetable gardens, fence rows, fields. We have just fields sometimes of sunflowers that we use to for pictures like for weddings and proms and things like that, just because of how gorgeous they are. The sunflower itself has these very hairy lanceolate leaves. They have more of an alternate leaf arrangement. However, if you kind of look at the bottom, sometimes that leaf arrangement can change at the bottom of the stem to more of an opposite arrangement. When it comes to the florets themselves, often the florets are yellow with kind of this brownish orange center disc. Now, of course, we all know, especially with the annual sunflower, that there are many, many different cultivars out there that have more orange or burgundy or even bicolored ray florets on them. So, and then you can buy kind of smaller flowering sunflowers, and then you can get the really big mammoth sunflowers that are, could have like four of my heads in that one flowering structure, so they can get quite big. So the variety of sunflowers is pretty great. Now, when it comes to other aspects of this plant, so we use this, of course, in food production with the seeds, and we can make oil from the seeds. A lot of people might eat it almost like a peanut butter too. They'll use a sunflower butter for meals. Native Americans actually would kind of grind the seeds up into a flour and bake them into a type of cake. There are some medicinal purposes for this sunflower as well, where they may have been used to treat snake bites. So they almost use it kind of as a topical treatment for snake bites. But then they also ingested to help treat things like, chest pains or even some respiratory ailments. Uh, Something that I have not tried, but there are certain sunflowers that if you kind of steam the flowering bud, it almost has an artichoke taste to it. Again, I have not tried that, so if anyone has ever steamed the buds and have tried to consume it, I'd be curious if it does have an artichoke flavor to it. So again, I that is pretty new to me. Um, Primarily, whenever I'm growing this, I'm growing it strictly for the pollinators. And so that's what I'll talk about next is a lot of times when we plant these seeds, they're going to be blooming, in during the mid to late summer months into the fall. And so it's a great late nectar source for pollinators. It also is a good host plant because, again, a lot of different Helianthus species are found natively in the US. for things like the silvery checker spot butterfly, and it helps support different specialized bee populations as well. So it's really good to be growing um, Helianthus in general to help support our insect populations. So. And then just some other things to note. Um, Sometimes the seeds can be used to make a type of purple gray dye. So kind of what's becoming more popular is, people are trying to find natural dyes, or maybe it could be a fun project with kiddos on finding some different plants in the garden that you can kind of create natural paint with, so to speak. So this is kind of one of those examples there. But I know a few extension offices are actually creating what they're calling natural dye gardens. So it's pretty neat. All right, this is where I will go back to the chamomiles, okay? So not to confuse you, because ideally I should have had them back to back, but this is German chamomile. So this is the one that we typically have in our teas. So if we're looking at chamomile tea, it's probably German chamomile. And you'll probably see seed packets of it also available in a lot of our garden centers and box stores too. So, but it is very similar looking to the Roman chamomile as well. It has those white ray florets with those yellow disc centers. Now we often will treat this one as an annual. Okay, so we're going to be planting it from seed, and then eventually it will die off come fall. Now, with chamomile, not only are the flowers showy, but I particularly like the foliage. It kind of has more of this fluffy, feathery foliage, very kind of deeply dissected leaves to them. And so primarily when people are growing this or they're wanting to grow it, they're using it for the purposes of making it in tea because it has kind of that sedating effect. It's very calming. And so I feel like when we buy different teas, they'll always say like nightly calm or, something like that for our chamomile teas, because this is the type of tea that at the end of a long, stressful day, we're going to want to drink just to, kind of unwind a little bit. So it's definitely a de-stressor, if you will. A lot of people also will drink chamomile tea to help them if they are very sick as well. So, like my father, he was from Germany, and the kind of what they used in Germany was this interesting concoction, if you will, where you would brew some chamomile tea and then you would put bread in it and then you would just kind of like inhale the steam from it, and it was a very odd thing, but then it was supposed to like really help your sinuses and things like that. So um but I did not particularly like that as a child, but they did use that growing up. Now you can use chamomile for other options as well. You can use it in potpourri and as a craft too. Now, something I will mention, and unfortunately this is becoming more common, is there are people that are actually allergic to members of the Asteraceae family, which is just very unfortunate. I mean, it's horrible to have any kind of allergy, but especially for the Asteraceae family, for how beautiful these plants are and how much we use them in our gardens. Um, it can definitely be a problem. And so for people that have that allergy, most notably, a lot of times when they have this allergy, they also have the ragweed allergy. So especially if you're particularly just allergic to ragweed as it blooms late summer into fall, you may have kind of a sensitivity to chamomile as well. And so, it's just definitely something to be mindful of, because this could cause not only allergic skin reactions, but even some swelling of your mouth as well. So just be mindful of that. If you do have that allergy or you know somebody that has that allergy or is more sensitive to ragweed, if you're consuming chamomile, just kind of watch out for that possibility of having an allergic reaction. But otherwise, chamomile just all around great herb. All right. I feel like I also have to talk about Rudbeckia again. Some of these are like more common aster plants, Asteraceae family plants, but these are ones that we see most notably all the time. And so we have many different species of Rudbeckias. A lot of them are native to the United States. We have a lot of native species. Um, and this is where for those of you who have had classes with me, especially on perennials, I kind of go on a rant on the difference between Rudbeckia fulgida versus Rudbeckia hirta. And that it has not changed. I'm about to go on a rant, so just excuse me for a second. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing this presentation and I'm going to point you to a website that does a really great job at pointing out the differences between Fulgida and Herta. So let me stop sharing real quick and then I'm going to um, move to the website, okay? So let me share that. All right. So this is from South Dakota Extension, and they do a really good job at telling the difference between Rudbeckia, Hirta, and Fulgida. So let me just break this down for you. Rudbeckia hirta is what we consider the annual Rudbeckia. So this is actually a black-eyed Susan, if you will, because pretty much all Rudbeckias are called black-eyed Susans or brown-eyed Susans of that nature. And that's where we get into confusion with the common name. And so when we look at Rudbeckias, it's really good to look at the scientific name to know the difference. So Rudbeckia hirta is what we consider the annual Rudbeckia. So this is actually going to be killed by frost, but it sets seeds so frequently that you may have it sprout from seeds the following year that might make you think, oh, this is a perennial Rudbeckia when it's actually not. A lot of times with the Rudbeckia hirta, when we compare that to Fulgida, which is the perennial Rudbeckia, the flowers on the hirta are generally larger and more showy. It has more showy, longer ray florets on it. And so you can kind of see that from the pictures here between the hirta and the Fulgida. Um, Sorry, my mouse is not functioning. Hold on. Why did I do this? All right, hold on. My mouse doesn't want to cooperate. So let's hold on. Let me stop sharing. This is when I shouldn't mess with technology. Okay. All right. Here we go. All right, let me get back to it. Okay, perfect. We're back at it. I'm just gonna leave it on the screen, okay? Okay, so when we get into Rudbeckia hirta, um, the foliage actually differs too from the other. So with hirta, the foliage has more hairs. It's more covered in hairs. Um, that from Fulgida, which has kind of more smoother leaves. And then also the difference is with the annual Rudbeckia hirta, the foliage is usually more of a kind of lance shaped leaf, whereas Fulgida is kind of almost more rounder, especially rounder more where it meets um, the stem. So there's the difference there. Also with Rudbeckia fulgida, that is rhizomatous. So it is spreading through rhizomes. It can still set seed, of course, and spread through seed, but it's definitely going to kind of be aggressive in the garden. Uh, not I I would never want to call a native plant invasive because it is native and it's found here. It's a good garden plant and good especially in prairie type settings, but it can overtake the garden. So you just kind of be need to be mindful of them and space it out um as you see fit. So, but yes. So just to kind of break it down again, Hirta, Rudbeckia hirta is the annual Rudbeckia, has bigger flowers, kind of more lance-shaped leaves, hairier leaves, whereas Rudbeckia fulgita is the perennial, spreads through rhizomes, has kind of more rounder leaves that are smoother and smaller flowers. Okay, so difference between those two. All right, let me go back to my presentation. Okay. And one thing that I also wanted to mention too, with Rudbeckia fulgita is one of the more common cultivars that we have on the market is called Gold Storm. And that is a tried and true cultivar. That is one that is always going to fare very well in our garden beds. And it is still really good at attracting our pollinators and our goldfinches and other songbirds really appreciate the seeds. So again, leave those seed heads up during the late summer into fall. And as I had mentioned before, this is a good larval host plant for certain species. So again, you see the wavy lined emerald moth and the silvery checker spot butterfly all rely on this plant for its caterpillars to feed on. All right. Let's move to Solidago. So Solidago is our goldenrod genus. So Solidago, a lot of times goldenrod just in general gets a very bad rap, and I hate it because um, it's really a really good plant. Again, kind of with asters, it's what we consider a keystone plant species that's important for our insect populations. But a lot of people think this is what causes their allergy, and it's actually not goldenrod. It's usually ragweed, which is blooming about the same time as goldenrod, that's causing your traditional hay fever. And so just know that you don't have to freak out if you see goldenrod blooming anywhere. Usually it's not the goldenrod that's causing your allergy problems, it's the ragweed. So as I mentioned in a lot of my uh classes, you have the old Snow White film where the seven dwarves are sniffing goldenrod, sneezy sniffing goldenrod, and then sneezes, and it's like, no, goldenrod, shouldn't be causing your allergies. So don't base it off of the Snow White movie, okay? Um, so with that in mind, we have many different species of goldenrod. This, for example, is tall goldenrod. This is altissima. This is a very common goldenrod, very similar to our Canadian goldenrod as well. A very tall, upright species that will form very dense colonies. Again, it almost can be a little bit, I hate to say weedy, but a lot of times in disturbed areas where people have been doing construction, especially along roadways, parkways, along our houses, it kind of flourishes in more of those disturbed sites. And so just kind of be mindful of that. It might be a little bit more difficult to remove once it's there. But again, you may want to have tall goldenrod there just because it's a good um, pollinator magnet, a great late nectar food source, and then help support some of our caterpillars and specialized bee populations. Now, Something else that's really interesting about tall goldenrod is it has this interesting ability where it can suppress the growth of other plants, and that's called allelopathy. We're actually learning about that a little bit in our book club with our In Defense of Plants book. But with allelopathy, um, a lot of times these plants can produce these compounds, especially in their roots, where it's toxic and prohibits the growth of plants nearby. Just so then this plant, goldenrod, can kind of flourish and take over an area. So you have that chemical mechanism as well as the rhizomes that it produces. So it can really create, again, dense colonies of this plant. And so with tall goldenrod, where it gets its name, of course, is these can get as tall as us, pretty much. They can get tall. And if we have a big rainstorm and wind, they can easily flop over and kind of create a mess. But they have this more conical shape to the flowers. Um, Conical, and then like I think of Canadian goldenrod, which is similar, kind of has more of this pyramidal shape to it as well. Um, but this may not be the one that you would want to plant in your garden per se, unless you just want it to take over a field or a prairie type setting. There are other goldenrods that are more bush-like or shrub-like that are going to be a little bit more aesthetic and easier to maintain. And so there is one cultivar I always recommend that's called Fireworks. It is a cultivar, but it still gives the same benefits to our pollinators. And Fireworks has more of that bush like growth habit. So it's a little bit easier to grow in a garden bed setting as opposed to this tall goldenrod that can easily take over and again kind of flop over as we get bad storms. But it's fine in again in the sense that you can keep this growing in fields and not disturb it to help support our pollinator and bee populations. All right. So let me end on this tried and true one too that everyone knows about pretty much, and that is our zinnia. So zinnias are a common annual that we start from seed. Of course, we can grow container plants, but I find them to be much easier to grow from seed. And even though we often treat them as an annual, if we leave those flowering heads up through the fall into winter months, a lot of times plenty of seeds fall to the ground and it will reseed for you and sprout the next year. And that's what I found. I have a whole little bed area of just zinnias, and I've planted the seeds once, and that's it. For the past 5 years, they set seed every year for me, and I just get a whole area of just zinnias and are oh my goodness, the pollinators just absolutely love it. I get so many butterflies, a lot of swallowtail butterflies. I get a lot of the little skippers, bumblebees, hummingbirds, and then of course we get a lot of birds as well. A lot of goldfinches like to feast on the seed heads of these as well. But with zinnias, these are also not just a good pollinator plant, but they're a good cut flower. And so there are different flower shapes from commonly kind of more of a buttercup shape to more of the double, semi-double flowers that you see. Um, Sometimes the stamens, the reproductive parts can be seen. Other times, if it's really in that double form, you may not see them as much. But a lot of times you have kind of those yellow stamens that appear in the center, and they can be actually used as a natural dye as well. And whenever you cut them too, sometimes you may get a little bit of that yellow pollen on your hands too. Um, some other things to note, as we know, if you have grown zinnias for many, many years, very prone to powdery mildew and fungal leaf spots, it's inevitable. You will see varieties that claim to be resistant to these diseases. I wouldn't believe them. I've not really seen a good cultivar that still maintains that resistance. But all I can tell you is it's not I don't worry about that impact that much just because, sure, it's aesthetically displeasing, but a lot of times it's kind of coming on later in the season anyway, where I'm not really worried too much if it has a fungal leaf spot or mildew here or there. And so you shouldn't be worried about that either. It's really not that problematic. But yeah, overall, really great annual that I plant for the bees and the butterflies every year, and really reseeds well. All right. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. Um, so that's a lot to knock out within an hour. So thank you all for staying with me. Does anyone have any questions before we conclude for today? And sorry, I should say you can like put the questions in the chat or you can unmute as well. Awesome. No, thank you all for joining us. Our next class is going to be March 11th. And so that's going to be on the Brassicaceae family. That's going to be on our crucifers. So we're kind of switch gears from the flowers a little bit, and we're going to talk about some of our more, vegetable heavy families. So hopefully you all can stay tuned for that next one. So thank you all so much. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm gonna conclude. Thank you all.